Good evening, everybody. I'm real pleased to see all of you here, and hope you enjoy a little bit about the book, and hope you have some interest perhaps in purchasing it, because there's no way I can cover what I've covered in the book in 45 minutes or an hour or a day probably, because of the nature of the book. And again, thanks. I'd like to add just a couple of things which I always seem to forget. Number one, I come of Czech heritage. My grandparents, my maternal grandparents, basically came from my grandmother from a city just outside of Prague, a place called Strashice, to the west of Prague. My grandfather comes from a place called Burshice, which is in the mountains right on the border of Austria. My paternal grandparents immigrated and came into Texas through Galveston and settled in the Shiner area of Texas. They were farmers down there. My dad moved to Cleveland to follow his brother, who was an engineer on the New York Central Railroad, met my mother, and that's basically how we are. I met my wife, who happens to be a Slovak, and we consider ourselves in a mixed marriage in some company. So we enjoy that. We have a little bit of fun with that from time to time. What you're looking at right now is the cover of the book, Settlement, Growth, and Movement of the Czechs and their institutions in Cleveland, Ohio. Next. I put in here just a little brief summary from the Ex Libris company, who's the publisher of the book, that sort of put in some decent words what the book is about. It describes the book as illustrated with numerous maps, photos, and figures. The book, published by Ex Libris, by me, offers readers a historical account of Czech immigration to the United States and their 170 years of the settlement, growth, and movement in Cleveland. This may seem like an impossible task, and it was, and it still is, but what I discovered when I was doing some research to write a book, I found that nobody has written a comprehensive history of the city of Cleveland since Hugo Chotek, somewhere around 1895. People have talked about Cleveland in many different ways, but never made an attempt to put together all of the things about Cleveland, the institutions, the settlements, and essentially the Czech culture and how it moved over time in the city of Cleveland. So basically, it's this 170-year history of the Czechs in Cleveland. Just recently, within the past couple of weeks, I did get an interesting book review by Nicole Yerkaba, who is with the U.S. Review of Books, and it just came in a newsletter kind of a thing. And she described the book as, with its delightful photographs depicting important groups, people, and buildings, this book brings history to life for modern readers. For readers specifically interested in the Cleveland area, this book is a necessity. This book is like an episode of Rick Steves' Europe, but with a fascinating focus on the Czech diaspora. And to get that review made me feel good, because I feel like I've accomplished at least part of what I meant to do. Next. The first thing, the first chapter of the book, I took a little bit of time to basically write a history of the Czechs. In all the talks I've given and the many times that I've discussed Czechs in Cleveland, I always bring along a board, which I've put together, that talks about the chronological history of the Czechs. That board has always had a great deal of interest, and even people of Czech heritage oftentimes didn't know much about their own heritage. And so it was something that I thought I would elaborate on and basically put together a chronology of almost 2,000 years of Czech history and compressed it into a couple of slides. I'm going to hit a couple of the highlights very quickly, just to remind people of some of the important events that have occurred in Czech history and how we got right now to what is now the Czech Republic. Some of the interesting things, of course, go back to the origins and the legends. Originally, when the Romans were occupying and gathering territory further and further north, they basically, at the end of their northern excursions, basically talked in their mapping about the Boii people who were living north of their borders, that it was like a wilderness kind of a thing, that it was the land of the Bohemians. And they later took on the Latin form of Bohemia, and that's where the concept of Bohemia comes from. More legendary, though, is the idea of the picture that you see there of the Czechs. There was a Slavonic tribe who migrated into that Bohemian area as the Celts were moving around. And they basically were led there by Jan, in again, legend, Jan Czechs. And of course, that's where the Czechs basically got their name. And it's sort of an interesting story. I do remember the name when I was taking Czech class at Komenský Hall as a boy. Next. I'm going to talk again very quickly about some of the major accomplishments of the Czechs, who for over 2,000 years were really trying to establish an identity, particularly around their own language, and basically some of how they were able to achieve freedom on a couple of occasions, but for a large portion of that time were oppressed peoples with sort of bits and pieces of freedom along the way. The first group of people that represent an organized Czech presence was the Great Moravian Empire, some beginning about 800 or so. The second, which was very important to Czech history, are the two golden ages of medieval Bohemia. And this gets back to Przemysl dynasty and the St. Wenceslaus and all of the other people that were part of those dynasties at that time. Most of this, of course, were kings that were operating and having kingdoms that came together and basically developed into a pretty strong political and military operation in Bohemia. And Prague became a crossroads of Europe, basically. Charles University, which was the first university north of the Alps, was established 1348. Charles IV was crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 1355. And then for those of you who can see the picture there, the Charles Bridge and Rudkany Castle were basically built during this period. Rudkany Castle today in the Guinness Book of World Records is noted to be the oldest ancient castle in the world. So it's sort of an interesting kind of piece of history. Next. That's basically what I just talked about. Next. The next group, the next thing that happened was during the time that the Bohemian estates were losing their ability, didn't really have a strong leader, they elected to bring in one of the Habsburgs and to serve as the King of Bohemia, and of course, King of and be part of the Holy Roman Emperor at that particular Holy Roman Church, basically at that time too. And what happened is that the Habsburg Emperor basically decided that it was after that, it was no longer going to be an election, that basically what they did, they simply began hereditary rule. And that hereditary rule went from this period in the 1400s or 1500s, basically until the First World War. So they were basically in control of the Czech lands for a long period of time. Next. Then who are the Czechs again? This is what Czechoslovakia looked like at the end of First World War. Bohemia, Moravia, Slovakia, and the Carpatho area. And essentially that was the map of Czechoslovakia that existed for a while until next. until basically the Germans pulled off the Czech, the Bohemians and the Moravians, and it became a protectorate. And then, of course, beyond that, all the other things that had happened, the First World War or Second World War, the Sudetenland, of course, Chamberlain gave away much of the borderlands, which unfortunately was where all the defenses were to fight off the Nazis if they ever invaded Czechoslovakia. So when he gained the Sudetenland along the borders, basically the Czechs lost all of the land which contained the defenses that would have been able to provide them defenses against that. And of course, the next thing was the Soviet oppression when they came in, and then a couple of other developments led ultimately to the freedom of the Czech people as now the Czech Republic. So much of what I'm going to talk about, or what we're looking at, is the Czechs are the people from Bohemia and Moravia, specifically for the purpose of the book. Those are the people who I defined as the Czechs. For those of you who are in genealogy, though, you recognize that as I began to look into a lot of detail as I began to look into a lot of detail about where people came from in this country, it was being mixed up between Austrian Hungarians, Bohemians, Czechoslovakians. So the numbers of people in terms of where their specific area of emigration was from was sometimes difficult. Now, the first Czechs who basically came into the Cleveland area were the Moravian Brethren. This is a group that broke away. They were part of the Hussites that basically left the Czechoslovakia area or the Bohemian lands in during the 30 Years' War, and eventually became missionaries. And some of those missionaries came to the United States pretty early, and they actually had established in the tributary of the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland, a small Indian reservation where they were going to actually be missionaries to the Indians. Unfortunately, the British were still influencing the other Indians in the area, and they were essentially pushed out fairly quickly. The map shows Cleveland, which is located, or what becomes Cleveland. You got in the middle of the river, the Cuyahoga River, and then it shows west side and east side. For those of us in Cleveland, that's how we view the city. We look at the east siders and the west siders, and never the twain shall meet, so to speak. There are distinct differences, and people lay claim to being east and west siders. Next. An interesting study I went through trying to get some idea of what was happening with the Czechs when they moved in Ohio. I went back into the records in terms of trying to determine immigration patterns from the US census data. And I put together this series of maps, which is sort of an interesting study in terms of the pattern with which the Czechs had moved into the United States. Of course, if you look at the first map, 1870, almost all the Czechs were moving all the way out to Iowa, Wisconsin, and basically Illinois, but they were giving away farmland. Of course, it was homesteading. And in terms of where Teresa's at the museum, many of those people were coming over and getting land and opening farms, and that became farmers in this area. As you went on a little bit later into the 1900s, you'll notice that there was still a lot of people moving into those agricultural areas, but also quite a few moving into Illinois, people stopping off in Ohio, and some into New York, a lot into California, incidentally. And I've never seen a lot of presence of the Czechs in California in terms of Sokol groups or freethinker halls or even churches, Czech churches or Bohemian churches. As you get into 1920, Of course, most of the people that were moving into the big cities in New York, Ohio, and Illinois. And similarly in 1950 and 1960. If you look at the map of Ohio, you'll see almost all of the Czechs who came into Ohio moved into Cuyahoga County. Next. Now, sort of ignore all the stuff on the left there, except for the dates. But if you turn to the right, you'll see the number of people in Cuyahoga County and Cleveland. Cleveland is located within Cuyahoga County. And if you take a look at the number of people in Cleveland, the first people to show up here were at about 1850. And Ledbetter had reported about 3 families, maybe 15 in 1860, 5,000. A year there wasn't much, but it was showing about 10,000. Cuyahoga County, 14. And then as you get into the 20s, you'll see we're up into the 27, 40,000 kind of numbers. So the Czech immigration into Cleveland was very, very significant. And I think a lot of people really don't realize how large a population and how significant the Bohemians were and the Czechs were in the Cleveland area. Next. The next talks a little bit about a few important things that I think just to keep in mind as we go along in this journey. 1910, I think a lot of people do not realize this. Cleveland had the 4th largest population of Czech-born inhabitants in the world, exceeded only by Prague, Vienna, and Chicago. I would ask for a show of hands to see how many people knew that, but I did not really realize that until I happened to see the note and checked it out myself. The other thing that was very significant about the Czechs is the literacy rate of Czech immigrants to the United States was extremely high. It was unusually high. It was 97%, which is a very, very high rate of literacy, particularly in terms of people immigrating from the Eastern European countries. And although the Czechs who immigrated to Cleveland were bound together by a common language and by shared customs, and most had identified themselves as Catholics when they came into the country, when they entered the US, they almost all switched over and were declared to be freethinkers or progressives, anti-clerical people with no religious affiliation and actively really anti-clerical. They didn't like the church at that point. The reason being, think about how long the Habsburgs required them to practice Catholicism and to speak in German, for example. So as a result of that, these people, while they still claimed to be Catholics when they came over, at that point felt that they were free and essentially broke away from their religious affiliation. And the philosophies of these two groups, the Catholics and the freethinkers, basically affected almost every Czech American, and they were pressured in some ways to make a choice. I could talk about some of our neighborhood disputes between these people when I was a young boy, but we won't get into that right now. There were also some Czechs who were Protestants and a few Jews. Some of the Jews were the first who came here, actually, but there were a few Protestants and Jews, but not very many. It was either the Catholics or the freethinkers that made up essentially the Czechs here in Cleveland. The Catholics and freethinkers settled in the same neighborhoods, and that's sort of an interesting kind of thing, but not, it's just perfectly understandable. They built halls that provided a center for Czech culture, social activities, and basically provided opportunities to cope with the financial, political, institutional, and other needs of the communities. And most of these associations were ideological. They were either freethinker or Catholic. And that's even among, for example, if you take a look at the organizations that some of the benefit organizations who persist today, the CSA, for example, Czechoslovak, what was originally the Czechoslovak Society of America, and the Czech Catholic Union are the Czech and what would be considered the freethinker groups that formed the first, and they're now insurance companies, which were these kind of support groups. Now, everything, the restaurants, taverns, bakeries, butcher shops, banks, and other commercial establishments that were owned by Czechs, they basically served, because it was in a familiar language, both the Catholics and the freethinkers. But nevertheless, this distinction was pretty important in terms of the development of the neighborhoods. Next. Now, the first slide basically shows all of the Czech settlements in Cleveland. This just sort of gives you an overview of those settlements. I talked earlier about the east side and west side. The west side, we basically had two major settlements, Kubu and Brooklyn. And on the east side of the river, we had quite a few more. Hillcross and Commerce, which was one of the first, Quincy, which was an outlying area, Croton, Burwell, which is closer to downtown. The biggest was the Broadway area. This was, for all practical purposes, called Little Bohemia, and you'll see why in a minute. And then there was Carlin, which is a little bit later development, and the Mount Pleasant Corlett area, which is where I was born and raised, was one of the suburban areas, as was Maple Heights. Next. Now, if you take a look at this map, it shows the first Czech settlements, and it explains a few things too, just to look at this. Hillcross and Commercial Streets, which was the closest. And you'll notice that there's St. Mary's on the Falls Church. At that time, that was the only Catholic church in town. And for a period, that was the only place that the Czechs could begin to come together as Czechs for Czech Bohemian masses. The other areas that developed here was the church of St. Wenceslas, which they built. It was hand built by the people who moved into this area, built in 1867. And so that was the first established area where people began to congregate, go to mass. However, as I pointed out, because of this juxtaposition between the freethinkers and the Catholics, the freethinkers built their own halls. They built Slovenska Lipa Hall, later replaced by Perun Hall in the same area. So as you go through all the neighborhoods of Cleveland, one characteristic will be that there will be a Catholic church, usually which was the first one built in the area, but then the freethinkers would come together and build a hall also. The freethinker halls oftentimes post-dated the Catholic churches because they would meet in somebody's hall, just a private hall, until they got a group together with enough money to build their own hall. But in each case, that was basically what was happening. As you look at this next slide, it talks about prior to 1967, the Catholic Bohemians had separate services in St. Peter and Joseph Church before Our Lady of the Flats, and this was in German. And they had German, but sometimes there was the people who could speak Czech. Most of the people who could speak Czech also spoke German. My maternal grandparents were fluent in both Czech and Czech. And early on, before they built the cathedral, which was dedicated specifically to the Czechs, then they would go to St. Peter's and St. Joseph. Now, St. Mary of the Flats was an interesting church because after it served the Czechs, it also served the Irish for a while until they built their church. It served other groups. I can't recall if the Hungarians were involved, but there were about 4 or 5 different ethnic groups who utilized St. Mary's of the Flats until they built their own church. And then when they built their own church, of course, then they moved out of, didn't use St. Mary's of the Flats, and essentially St. Mary's of the Flats didn't have much use and eventually was closed down. It did become a cathedral for a while, but nevertheless, the demand for it wasn't very great. The bottom picture shows you a picture of St. Mary's of the Flats, the first St. Wenceslas Church. which was hand-built by the people from the neighborhood. And again, on the right is Slovenska Lipa Hall, which is the first hall built by the freethinkers in that area. Next. A couple of other areas. The other area that was really important, and this again was the center of all the Czech activities in Cleveland at that in the early years, and it talks about some of these neighborhood sub-neighborhoods. Na Vršku means on the hill, and this was an area that overlooked the flats where St. Mary's was, which was developing basically as an industrial area. Rockefeller had his refinery down at the bottom of the hill, and a hill they used to call Jackass Hill because they would haul stuff up and down that hill with jackasses, and it developed that name. And Vrško, the Czechs had moved at the top. They found employment there as a lot of them were barrel makers from the old country, and actually were able to find employment making barrels for Rockefeller at that particular time. The other thing that you'll see here is we've got a couple of things that need to be noted in terms of the Catholic Church, of course, was one of the first things in that the new St. Wenceslas, when the old St. Wenceslas was too small, they built the new St. Wenceslas further up Broadway. This is further south to where the original one was built. And then from there, essentially, most of the Czech and Bohemian activities occurred. They had a number of small halls, Sokols Czech Hall, but the big one is Bohemian National Hall, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about in a minute. And there were a lot of these different neighborhoods. People call them, where are you from? I'm from the Husinec area, or from Dakota, or from Prague. And they knew exactly what streets you were talking about when you made reference to that. Next. Now, as you go and take a look at that Na Vršku area, looking up from the Standard Oil Company up into the hill, with the Vršku meaning the top of the hill, you'll see where Rockefeller's Standard Oil refinery was. There's a story that goes on that's been told, and it's true. One of the foremen for Rockefeller offered him stock in the company if he would invest in his Standard Oil Company. And this Bohemian guy was so conservative, he talked it over with his wife and said, no, we're just going to work for wages and not bother to put our money into something like this. He passed up the venture, and obviously missed out, maybe perhaps becoming a millionaire in the process. In the same area, just another couple of other small areas, a number of other small places where people live. However, you'll see at this time already, at the time of this map, a lot of the streets that were originally named after the Czechs, Písek Avenue, Palačky, Beran, those streets are all gone, Svoboda. So a lot of this was changing even at that time. The most important building right now, and probably historically in that neighborhood, is Bohemian National Hall. And really a fascinating story, and one that's worth talking a little bit about. In 1887, there were 9 immigrants that met to discuss plans for the establishment of a cultural center in the Broadway area. Again, we're looking at 20,000 plus people that lived in this area. And again, free thinkers, they wanted to erect some kind of a hall. They started fundraising in 1891 and 92 with picnics led by Václav Snyder, who was the editor of the Nowy Wiek, and basically had a huge parade in which they actually brought the keystone down with 500 marchers and over 40 Czech organizations, basically, and built the hall. So the hall was built and started in 1894, eventually finished in 1897. The top floor, if you look at the top floor of the building there, you'll see next on the slides, please. I forgot to tell you to move to one more. I'm sorry about that, guys. And if you look at the top floor, you'll see that number of windows there. That was a separate floor that was divided up into cubicles, where all of the people who were in what was called a patronat, the people who funded these various clubs, had a place where they could keep their records and meet and essentially get together and come together as a council to guide the development of Bohemian National Hall. And eventually they built an annex in 1911, which is still there and still serves as a Czech language training school. And it's there that serves other kinds of things too. There were, since then, of course, many other Czech societies that met on a regular basis at the hall, and still is a very popular place. One of the biggest events was a presentation of Smetana's Bartner Bride by the Czech Drama Society in 1898, where they had 1,650 people with 300 waiting outside. Since then, they've had hundreds of plays. There's beautiful stage settings that have been built and are still stored in that facility. And it really is. Next slide, please. The next slide just shows a few things. After the purchase of the hall by the Sokols Greater Cleveland in 1975, which they wanted to build an expansion area for the gymnastics, because there's been a very active Sokol group that operated at the Bohemian National Hall. So in 75, they got funding assistance from Cleveland Foundation and the Ohio Historical Society. They restored the hall, including the construction of a new modern gym addition, and then they revitalized the activities at the hall. It was a very, very successful program. And the picture that shows the hall in the background also shows the new Czech Cultural Center and Bohemian National Hall combination. What you see on the right is the stage in the hall, and that happens to be the Cleveland's Women's Orchestra playing for the 100th centennial anniversary. Bottom left is a picture from the museum. The center is the picture of the Pride of Cleveland, and that's the Cleveland Sokol organization, Greater Cleveland, Sokol Greater Cleveland organization. As you can see, all age groups, and it's a very, very popular program that basically helps to support the operations in the cultural center, and is a great place for young people to become involved in both in their culture and in gymnastics and some of the things that other activities that they get involved in. The bottom right is one of the dinners that is held periodically when there's no COVID problem. Next, I'm just going to very briefly mention the only significant Protestant activities in this area was basically the Bethlehem Chapel and the Bohemian Bible Reader School. The Methodists tried to essentially build a little, like a junior college for women, and provided Bible readers training, and provided home economics training, and built a couple of chapels in the area, and had hoped to essentially be missionaries for the Czech people to bring them in and Americanize them. It was never very successful. All of these buildings have been torn down. One interesting thing about this is Dr. Schaffler, who was following up on Huss's, who preached in a Bethlehem Chapel in Prague, all followed the same architecture with the one steeple. If you look at the far left, that was one of the chapels. The next one has that same kind of characteristic. And the two that were built out in the neighborhoods, very, very similar architecture, holding to Huss's Bethlehem Chapel architecture. Next. Getting into the West Side neighborhoods, Brooklyn and Kubu, same story. In the case of the West Side, we basically have one Catholic church, which was St. PROKOP's, and then eventually the number of places that the freethinkers met, and some of the names of those places are here. But ultimately what they did, they developed and purchased the old Hungarian Hall in 1890, essentially, but they had a beer garden associated with their hall, and essentially it became the Czech Český syn Sokol, and then the Sokol Český syn group, which was actually a Sokol gymnastics group, operated there also. So we started off with St. Prokop's. Eventually, now we have Český Sokol syn, and then of course, many of these other places are no longer there. Next. This gives you a picture of what those places look like right now. We took a look at St. Prokop's, for example, 3 cases in all. They built the original, then here's one later, one at the end, and notice that the steeples on the last one to the right are broken off. They were never replaced, and St. Prokop's is now closed. For about a year and a half, because of an argument over seating one of the priests at St. Prokop's, the bishop actually closed the church down for a year until the people petitioned that it be reopened, because they lost a priest and a new priest had been assigned, and they objected to the new priest. And so they ran into a major problem with the diocese until they apologized and they reinstituted, and they called it the Catholic Wars in the newspapers. Next. Picture of Český syn Sokol, the building, and then this is the gymnasium, which was originally the beer garden, and it is now used as a gymnasium. So again, one of the institutions, the freethinker institutions that was built there. Next. I just put this in here for only one reason. This is a list, and this took me a long time to develop, of every Sokol organization that existed in the city of Cleveland, beginning with Slovenska Lipa. And as you can see, they met in all kinds of different places. And I was able to get pictures of virtually all but one of these places into the book, and a little bit of a history of each of these. Next. The next thing that are important to recognize about Cleveland is Cleveland, in addition to the neighborhoods, they have a number of encampments, groves, the Czech Cultural Garden, and Crown Hill Cemetery, all of which have a role in all of this. And they're sort of spread out primarily, again, on the east side, except for the Czech Cultural Garden, which is located near the lake. But the rest of them, PROKOP, VELKY, Fresh Air Camp, DTJ Farms, Sokol Fresh Air Camp, and the Legionnaires' gravesite are all basically part of this story. And as we go on, next. One of the other big gymnastics operation that went on, and a place that I went to as a boy, to summer camp and gym and did summer camp with them, was Dolnické Televičné Jednoty, the DTJ group, Workers Gymnastic Union. And they're still in existence, and they essentially developed over time, and it was sort of an interesting history that I discuss in the book. But you can see a couple of pictures that are important. It started off that they simply purchased some farmland. The farmland, they built a clubhouse on it. At one time, they had the Olympiad there. It was a gymnastic Olympiad. And then at the present day, it's one of the sites where Český den, it is the place now where Český den is held. So the bottom right picture is a picture of the new clubhouse with the Český den. Next. The other places that was important, which is sort of independent of the rest of these groups, but nevertheless is an important Czech place, is PROKOP VELKY Fresh Air Camp. And PROKOP VELKY Fresh Air Camp was a number of cottages, maybe 50 or so cottages on Tinker's Creek, which coincidentally is the same place where Heckfelder, if you remember, had his Indian encampment, but no relationship to this. And they have a clubhouse. You can see our family had a cottage there, and the picture of the cottage is there. And one of the things that annual events that takes place is a clam bake that's been pretty popular. Another place on the same road of PROKOP VELKY Fresh Air Camp happens to be the SLAPNICKA'S Grove. And SLAPNICKA'S Grove basically was a hunting club and a place where they had was a place to go to picnics, and it was a very popular place for many years. Next. An important concept was, of course, the teaching of language in the Czech community. And so language classes were normally held in both the Catholic schools, the parish schools, and then the freethinker schools. Father Kadelka, one of the Cleveland priests who taught at St. Prokop's, he actually proposed several readers that were used in the parochial schools throughout the United States. When he left St. Prokop's and was replaced by another priest, who's one that people went on strike, and it became the Catholic War. The Freethinkers Czech schools are in Cleveland started in about 1878, and the one on the east side and the other established on the west side. And basically, the Bohemian National Hall, which you spoke about earlier, was an important one to that. The Freethinker schools provided for second and third and fourth grade, and then eventually you went up into Legionnaires where you were in the plays and so on. And basically, each day, it was decided to fund these schools to hold an annual Czech Day picnic to obtain funds to support these schools. And the first of the several began about 1923 in the Bohemian gardens at Czechs and Sokols. Later, they went out to SLAPNICKA'S Grove. But at the present time, Český den, as you can see from the picture when I showed you the DTJ farm, was moved to DTJ Farm in Taborville, where it is still presented each year. And the picnic funds are distributed to the remaining schools in Bohemian National Hall, Český and Sokols on the west side, and the DTJ Taborville. So the persistence of funding for Czech school training education is going on. Next. Very briefly, just mention it because it's so important. Czech Cultural Garden was one of the areas set aside in 1934, the Cultural Garden chain in Rockefeller Park. And this was developed by the Cleveland Czech community to give a tribute to in the card by Franciszek Palaczki. And some pictures of the park are there. This is an overview of the park on the left. You can see Masaryk statue, and then the way the gardens are kept. Paul Burek, who may or may not be involved here and today, has been instrumental in keeping the garden up for many, many years. And he should be paid tribute for all he's done to accomplish that. This is a view of the wall with a frieze, and then two linden trees from Bohemia were planted at the garden in 1939 by President and Madame Betesh. It has a little bit of a history. There's more to it than this, but this at least says something about it. Next. The Czechoslovak Legionnaires, I'm not going to talk too much about. I have a book on this, another book that I've written about the Czech Legionnaires, but a couple of things. 362 men volunteered for the Czech legions This is in the First World War, and they were assured that they were going to meet the residency requirements for U.S. citizenship, and it wouldn't be lost when they were in the service. In 1918, a camp was established at Stamford, Connecticut, and at the farm of the sculptor Gutzon Borgum. Of the 1,500 Legionnaires who returned to the U.S. after the war, 113 were disabled, and 100 of those who were Clevelanders. So 100 of the 113 disabled vets from the First World War who were in the Czech Legionnaires were Clevelanders with no provisions for post-war medical care or pensions or anything. And when it was found out that one of them was put into a pauper's grave, the rest of the Legionnaires, the Cleveland Post of the Legionnaires, bought some grave sites at Crown Hill Cemetery, and basically anybody that chose to be buried there is buried there. This is a plaque. This is a picture of, on the left, bottom left, is Macetic in front of Probolov Hall, which was the recruiting center for the Czechoslovak Legionnaires. Center is a plaque with the names of the people who were buried there, and just another plaque that is associated with the Legionnaire's grave. Next. I had to mention it. I had this slide for other purposes, stuck it in here anyway. The most popular beer Bohemian beer in Cleveland for many years, no longer around, is a beer called POC, the Pilsner of Cleveland. And they had a huge brewery, POC brewery, which you see at the top left of the picture. Just had to put it in there. Next. With that, I think sort of brings us to an end to probably more than 45 minutes, but nevertheless, I just got a book review about 4 weeks ago, which I'm going to share with you because I hope it'll entice you into buying the book. Brilliantly written, well-organized, and intricately detailed book, author Stefan J. Sebesta, The Settlement Growth of the Czechs in Cleveland, is a must-read for the history buffs and those interested in the Czech culture overall. With plenty of artwork, graphics, charts to highlight the research and study, and so on and so forth. Basically, it really accomplish. Again, I don't claim to be brilliant or having written a brilliantly written book, but nevertheless, I think that it's a positive review and talks about being a good educational, enlightening read, and hope that it may entice you to buy the book, and I'd be glad to autograph it for you if you do. With that, I'm done. So Teresa, it's all yours.
All right, I'm gonna stop my screen share. And that is a great segue into, yes, so we have the book for sale with our museum store, and he will actually personally autograph each one that's purchased for everyone. So if you purchase one ahead of time, we will be sure to get that signed book label out to you after the fact, or if you purchase one tonight or tomorrow, or within the next couple of weeks, we'll send that out to you. And I will include the link to purchase the book in the chat as we're answering questions, and then in the follow-up email as well. So I want to give everyone some time to think about their questions. We did have one come through in the chat, so I will start with that one. So given the high literacy rates, did many of the immigrants get higher level jobs after immigrating? This person said, for instance, their ancestors had jobs that were listed as a machinist and a molder.
It's very interesting. The literacy rate had absolutely nothing to do with a person's station in life. It had to do with the fact that over the 2,000 years of Czech history, the preservation of the Czech language as part of the identity and culture of the Czech people, which was trying to be what they tried to preserve, became very important to them. So as a result, people learned to read and write. That's why that was important to them. It had no relationship. In 1848, after the Habsburgs had such a massacre, when the Czechs tried to revolt, a lot of the learned people that came out of it, because a lot of them were supporting freedom of Czechoslovakia. They wanted self-governance at that time. So there were groups of people. Another group were the groups that came after the Soviet invasion in Prague. So there were groups of intellectuals that came over, but had nothing to do with their literacy. The literacy had to do with the Czechs' desire, you know, like Hussite, the Hus wanted the Czech, he was a priest in the Catholic Church. He wanted the mass to be in Czech. And so people in Bohemia basically were trying to preserve the language and did so, even though the Habsburg, for example, wanted them to speak and communicate in German. And so it was almost an unconscious effort to preserve their culture by preserving their language, and in doing so, established a very high literacy rate. It's a long-winded answer to what may be a simple question, but that's basically it.
No, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
It was a great question, good answer. One person had a specific question about the photograph of the Bohemian National Hall. If you recall, what was the structure next to the hall?
Don't know.
Don't know.
That's just, I put that in there simply because it was a nice rendering. It was a rendering that was done at the time.
Got it.
And because it had that building next to it. I tried to research that, as a matter of fact, and I know there's an answer to it. When I put that in at the last minute and never finished the research to determine. If I were to guess, it looks like a restaurant, but I'm just guessing. But I don't know. I promised to find the answer to that question and somehow get it posted to someone. Because I have the same question. I don't know.
All right. What brought many Czechs and Slovaks into Cleveland in the early 1930s from neighboring states?
They didn't come from neighboring states. What was happening, most of the Czechs who came into Cleveland and even into your area basically were coming, I think this is true, certainly those that came into like Illinois and some of our area were coming out of New York. In other words, they were coming on boats landing in New York and then coming west. Coming west, initially at the turn of before the turn of the century, this was like the beginning of the stagecoach line to go to the farms. So for example, the people in your area in Iowa and so on, they got to Cleveland and there were no trains to go to Iowa. They were giving away land, and the only way to get to those lands was the same as it was when they were homesteading the West. You just take your horses and wagons and go, or take the stagecoach and go. And so Cleveland was a place where people were transitioning to go from one. At the same time though, Cleveland was becoming an industrial center. So many people who were coming through Cleveland basically said, wait a minute, you know, these are some pretty nice jobs here. You know, jobs like these jobs that this person is asking about. They were looking for barrel makers, for example, at the Rockefeller refinery. And there was opportunities in machine shops because there's a lot of steel here in Cleveland. And so a lot of people who were starting to manufacture steel products. And so they were looking for machinists and those kinds of people. And so many of those people weren't really trained in those trades, but it was an opportunity for them to learn them and a good place to earn a living and raise a family, and never went on further to go on to Iowa and Wisconsin in the process.
Mm-hmm. Alan Popelka had a question that he wanted to ask.
Yes, do you know what my last name Popelka means?
Spell it.
Popelka.
No.
Supposedly it means Cinderella in Bohemia.
Great name.
And my question is related to Bohemian versus Czech. My father was born in 1912 in Cleveland. And in fact, his parents lived in the Croton area that you talked about, which doesn't exist anymore now. It was destroyed by I-77.
Yes.
And he only ever said he was Bohemian. And in checking the ancestry things, looking at where people were from, it never says Czech. On my mother's side, they're from Slovakia. So before people that came over, or the census records before the First World War would always say Austria-Hungary,
Hungary, yeah,
or potentially Hungary, or it would say Bohemian.
yes.
And of course, after the First World War, it would say Czechoslovakia. So my question is Bohemia and Czech or Czech Republic, would you use those interchangeably or are those different?
Well, it depends in which context. If we talk about the Czech Republic, we're talking about Bohemia and Moravia provinces, which make up the current Czech Republic. And then when you get back to the Moravian Empire, which goes back a long ways, or the Przemysl dynasty during the Golden Ages, that was all sort of grouped together. However, Bohemians are unique in the sense that they are coming from that province rather than Moravia. My parents, as I said earlier, my maternal grandparents came from Bohemia. My paternal grandparents came from Moravia. And so the distinction is how you're referencing to it. Most of the people that here in Cleveland came from, were Bohemians that came from around the Písek area, České Budějovice, sort of down a little bit to the south of Prague. And, but a great number of them who actually settled here in Cleveland came from that area, but they came from many different places. But there was no way, as you already found out, you made reference to, for anybody that's in genealogy to go back and to look at records that are kept by the Census Bureau in terms of how they classified people. There's no way you're going to ever pick up where these people were from the census record of where they claim that they came from. It only comes from direct knowledge from family history or from some specific research that you may do to determine that. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Well, Bill, I got to remember that Cinderella.
Cinderella. There's a movie, Three Nuts for Cinderella, that we usually show around Christmas time.
Yeah.
Her name is Popelka.
Okay.
You touched on it a little bit, but specifically, did people come through Ellis Island that ended up in Cleveland for the most part? Yeah. Okay.
Just out of curiosity, Teresa, where did most of your people come through? Did they come through New York?
Yes, I believe so. Yeah. So we were very much like you were saying, we're usually kind of like the second spot, like they'd end up in the bigger, East Coast cities and then be looking for jobs, and would come up to Iowa. Yeah.
When they came in when they came into the country, they came through Galveston and they settled near Shiner, Texas.
Yes.
So they went in farming, but they were farming in Shiner, Texas. And
yeah, I've heard Texas, down in that area too. Let's see, we got lots of questions. What was the Czech influence on classical music in Cleveland? Classical
music is the essence of Czech culture in Cleveland. There was a family group called the Hrubies, who basically had a music store. They started off with a band. They had a band that used to play the festivals and the Great Western Band, they called them. The whole family were musicians. They eventually opened up a music studio and taught music, and the building of the studio still exists. I can't remember the number. John Stable may remember, I don't know. There were probably more than half dozen of those Hrubies who were performers for the Cleveland Symphony Orchestra for years and years and years. And so that's number one. Number two, the other part of it was that Czechs were always into plays. So there were a lot of musical productions that were put on, like The Bartered Bride and others that were just, they're mainstays in the Czech community. So from a musical standpoint, then we have a whole variety of other kinds of places where musical groups and theater groups, I can't take the time to name them all, but basically, even in the Catholic Church, in the Catholic school, Catholic churches, they actually had groups of people who were acting, music, in classical music specifically, were all very much a part of the Czech culture in Cleveland. And like I say, the influence of the Ruby family and others on classical music in the city of Cleveland goes into really even establishing themselves as a part of the Cleveland Symphony Orchestra, which is famous, incidentally, for Dvořák's New World Symphony, which I happened to hear while I was on the USAID mission to Argentina a number of years ago, sitting in a Minister of Culture's box in Buenos Aires, listening to the Cleveland Symphony play Dvořák's New World Symphony.
That's really cool.
It is cool.
So we are about 5 minutes over, and I do want to be respectful of everyone's time. But one thing that I can do, I'm going to ask you one last question, but then the rest of the questions that are in the chat, if you're okay with it, I'll send them to you and you can answer them, and then I can email them out to everybody.
I would be happy to do that.
Is that great? Okay, so I think this is a great question also because based off of our conversation we were having before we started, are there any functioning Sokols in Cleveland at this time? And if so, how can they be contacted?
Number one, I think I showed you the picture of the Bohemian National Hall with the Sokol group that's there. That group is called Sokol Greater Cleveland. Just click on Sokol, go into whichever your search engine is, put in Sokol Greater Cleveland. Believe me, you won't have any trouble finding it. And they would be most happy to provide any information you need about it. The second Sokol group that's still out there is CZECHSP, which is the West Side group. They are not as large, but they are still also active. So you can also click on Český Sokol Syn or Sokol Český Syn and just do a search, and you will find links to their groups. And those are the two active groups. DTJ is still also operating gymnasts, but this is one of the satellite areas on the far east side in Taborville. And so they don't actually have a hall within the city, but they also still have some gymnastic activities out there.
Yes, and one person did send the link to sokolgreatercleveland.org as well, so we can include those in the email I send out with all of your answers, and then of course with this recording itself. And I will, if you're trying to order the book now, I know someone did message me that it says it's sold out, which is a great problem to have, but we will be sure to get that. Everyone that's on this received a confirmation email from me, as well as a reminder if you registered before 3 p.m. Central Standard Time today. So you can reach out to me and we'll make sure to get you guys all a copy. I think this has been so wonderful, and I've learned so much, living here in Iowa about, Czechs in different places in the United States. So I really appreciate your time today, and thank you for sharing your expertise.
Thank you. Nashledanou, Shetzky.
And thank you all of you for being here with us tonight. So like I said, I will follow up with an email with lots of information, but thank you so much to everyone. And of course to you, Dr. Sebesta, and everyone have a good evening.
Thank
Good night.
you.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.